Story 1. The Night Stalker of Blackwood Forest. I grew up hearing the legends of Blackwood Forest. People said it was haunted. Others whispered about a beast lurking in the shadows, something beyond human understanding. I never believed those stories. That is, until I saw it myself. It was early fall, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. My buddy Mark and I had decided to camp deep in the woods, far from the usual trails. We wanted solitude, the kind that makes the world feel untouched. By sunset, we had set up camp near a small clearing, the fire crackling as we shared beers and stories. The first sign that something was wrong came with the silence. One moment, the forest was alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The next, it was as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances, both of us sensing the shift. Then came the sound, deep, guttural breathing, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was a bear, but the sound was too deliberate, too calculated. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them toward the trees, the beams slicing through the darkness. That's when we saw them, eyes. Large, glowing amber orbs staring back at us from the blackness. A chill ran down my spine as the figure stepped closer. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was something between man and beast, with a flat nose and a mouth that seemed too wide. The thing took a step forward, and the ground beneath it trembled. Mark cursed under his breath, gripping my arm. "We need to go," he whispered. But before we could move, it let out a sound that I'll never forget. A deep, resonating growl that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. You don't belong here. The fire flickered violently as the creature took another step, its massive hands flexing. I don't know if it was trying to scare us off, or if it had more sinister intentions, but we didn't wait to find out. We ran. Branches whipped against my face as we tore through the woods, adrenaline blinding us to everything but the need to escape. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush like a freight train. My heart slammed against my ribs as we neared the truck. Just as I fumbled with the keys, Mark let out a strangled scream. I turned to see him sprawled on the ground, his ankle caught in a tangle of roots. The creature was only yards away now, its heavy breaths hot against the night air. I didn't think. I just acted. Grabbing a flare gun from the truck, I fired. The flare shot up, illuminating the area in a ghostly red glow. The creature recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting howl before vanishing into the trees. We didn't wait around. I pulled Mark into the truck, and we sped off, not stopping until we reached town. We never spoke about that night to anyone. Not really. People wouldn't believe us. But I know what I saw. And somewhere out there, in the depths of Blackwood Forest, it's still watching, waiting. Story 2. The Silent Watcher of Pine Hollow. I was never the kind of guy to believe in monsters. That changed the night I saw it. It was late October, and I had gone on a solo hunting trip deep in Pine Hollow, a dense stretch of forest in northern Montana. I'd hunted here before. Plenty of deer, the occasional bear, nothing I couldn't handle. But this time, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. Usually, the woods were alive with noise. Birds, rustling leaves, distant howls. But that evening, there was nothing. Just a suffocating silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I shrugged it off and set up camp near a rock outcrop, about 2 miles from the nearest trail. By nightfall, I had a fire going, my rifle propped against a log as I cooked some canned stew. That's when I saw the first sign. Something had moved just beyond the tree line. A shadow, tall, broad, and deliberate. At first, I thought it was a bear, but the way it moved, it was too smooth, too calculated. I gripped my rifle, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The trees stretched out like endless black pillars, but there, just at the edge of the light, I saw them. Eyes. Huge, glowing, amber-colored eyes staring right at me. My stomach dropped. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a bear. It stood too upright, too still. My instincts screamed at me to get inside my tent, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't look away. Then, it did something that made my blood run cold. It smiled. Not a natural expression. This was something deliberate, something meant to unnerve me. The wide mouth curled just enough to reveal massive, yellowed teeth. And then, in the dead silence of the forest, I heard a sound I will never forget. Laughter. It was low at first, guttural and breathy, but then it mimicked my own chuckle, the exact same way I had laughed earlier that night while listening to a podcast. It was copying me. I was frozen, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone, vanishing into the trees like it had never been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my rifle, listening to the eerie silence, waiting. But nothing else happened. By sunrise, I packed up and hiked back to my truck, my skin crawling with the feeling of being watched. And as I reached the road, I glanced back one last time. There, on the ridge above me, stood the figure, watching, smiling. I never went back to Pine Hollow. I don't think I ever will. Story 3. The Howling Nightmare of Raven Creek. I've spent most of my life in the wilderness, hiking, camping, and hunting. I thought I knew the woods better than anything. But the night I saw it, I realized there are things out there we were never meant to understand. It was mid-November when I ventured into the Raven Creek Wilderness, a stretch of deep forest in Washington state. I planned to spend 3 nights alone, just me, my rifle, and the quiet solitude I'd always loved. The first day went fine. I set up camp near a small creek, cooked some venison jerky, and watched the sun dip below the towering trees. The air was cold but crisp, and I felt at peace. That didn't last. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. A deep, guttural howl echoed through the forest. Not a wolf, not a coyote. This was something different. It was long and mournful, vibrating in my chest like a distant storm. I sat up, my breath clouding in the freezing air. My first thought was a bear, maybe even a mountain lion, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. It was too deep, too resonant, almost human. I grabbed my rifle and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but other than that, everything was still. Then I saw the shape. Tall, massive, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was covered in dark, shaggy fur, its shoulders impossibly broad. It stood upright, but its posture was slightly hunched, like it was too big for its own body. And then it moved, slow, deliberate steps toward my camp. I clenched my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I just sat there, watching as it came closer. Then it did something that sent ice through my veins. It spoke. Not words, not exactly, but a garbled, growling noise that almost sounded like my name. Look, I don't know how, but it was trying to mimic me, trying to sound human. That was enough. I fired a shot. The bullet cracked through the air, and the creature let out a deafening, inhuman roar before vanishing into the trees with impossible speed. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I sat there, rifle in hand, waiting for dawn. As soon as the sky turned gray, I packed up and hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. But just before I reached my truck, I saw them, massive footprints in the mud. And next to them, in the dirt, was a word, scratched into the ground with long, clawed fingers. Luke. I never went back to Raven Creek. I never will. Story 4. The Thing in the Fog. I used to love hiking alone. Something about the solitude of the wilderness made me feel alive, until I saw it. It happened last spring in the Cascade Mountains. I had planned a 3-day solo trek through the deep woods, following an old logging trail few people used anymore. The first day was uneventful. Just me, the trees, and the distant rush of a river. Then the fog rolled in. By the second evening, the mist was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The trees turned into shifting shadows, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers in the dimming light. I had seen fog before, but this felt wrong. It was heavy, clinging, suffocating. I made camp early, my instincts screaming that something was off. The silence didn't help. No birds, no insects, just the eerie quiet of the mist-covered forest. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it. A low, guttural clicking sound. It came from somewhere deep in the fog, slow and deliberate, like something was speaking. The sound made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. At first, I saw nothing but swirling mist. But then, movement. Something huge shifted between the trees. Not a bear, not an elk. This thing was too tall, too broad. My breath hitched as the figure stepped closer, its outline becoming clearer. It was covered in shaggy, dark fur, its massive form barely visible through the fog. But the eyes, God, the eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, locked onto me like a predator watching its prey. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, it let out a sound, a deep, chest-rattling growl that sent a shockwave of fear through me. The thing was still partially obscured, but I could see its shoulders rise and fall with each breath. It was waiting, watching, and then it started to mimic me. A distorted, warped version of my own breathing echoed back at me. Shallow, panicked, my own fear, reflected in the sound of this thing. I bolted. I don't remember how I packed my gear. I don't remember how I found the trail. All I know is that I ran. I ran for hours, the fog making everything disorienting, but I felt it following me. Heavy footsteps, always just beyond the mist. By the time I reached my truck, the fog had begun to thin. I dared to glance back, just once, and there it stood. Not moving, not chasing, just watching. A massive silhouette in the fading mist, waiting for the next fool to wander too deep into its woods. Story 5. The Stalking Beast of Widow's Peak. I'll never forget the day I realized we aren't alone in the woods. It was the last time I ventured anywhere near Widow's Peak. It was a typical fall afternoon in the Pacific Northwest, and I decided to explore an area near an old logging town, one that hadn't been touched in years. I'd read about it online and knew few had gone out there recently. Perfect for a solo hike, or so I thought. I arrived early, the sun still hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The woods felt normal at first, too normal, almost, until I reached the base of Widow's Peak. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling of small creatures. It wasn't until I reached the base of the steep hill that I realized I was being watched. There was a clearing ahead, the trees opening up like a stage, and at the far side of the clearing stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone else hiking, though I hadn't heard anyone approach. But something about the way it stood unnerved me. It was too still, too quiet. I called out, my voice echoing slightly through the trees. No answer. Then, the figure shifted. It didn't walk. It didn't move like a human. It lurched, almost as if it were testing its own limbs, like something that hadn't used them in years. The movement was jerky, unnatural. That's when I saw it. A massive, hulking form, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders were so broad that they seemed to fill the entire clearing. The thing's face was grotesque, with a flat, wide nose, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes. It was looking right at me, its gaze piercing and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew I should turn and run, but my legs felt like stone. My survival instincts were drowned out by sheer terror. And then, it let out a sound that I'll never forget. A low, rumbling growl that shook the air, vibrating my bones. The growl was followed by something even worse, laughter. It wasn't a human laugh, though. It was warped and guttural, something deep and primal. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the underbrush, but my mind was too clouded to think clearly. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The creature took one slow step toward me, another, and then I heard a noise behind me, a cracking of branches. I turned, frantic, only to see the trees swaying violently, as if something was moving through them. In a blind panic, I broke into a full sprint. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that thing. I ran for what felt like hours, the fear driving me through the dense forest. Finally, when I saw the familiar sight of the trailhead, I couldn't hold it together anymore. I collapsed against the nearest tree, gasping for air, my legs shaking uncontrollably. But the worst part? The worst part was the message scratched into the bark of the tree beside me. "I'm still watching." I didn't wait to read more. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and never looked back. To this day, I haven't returned to Widow's Peak. I don't plan to. There are things in the woods that aren't meant to be seen, and I was lucky to make it out alive. But sometimes, even now, I swear I hear that laugh when the wind blows just right.